video, I'll be painting the same subject two ways, positively and negatively, and I will also explain which approach to use depending on your subject matter. I will be painting from this reference photo. First thing that I think about when I look at it is that I have fairly light background. The subject is light as well, but it has some shadows that are darker than the background, and also the focal point, the ladybug, is very intense color and also black, so it's much darker than the rest of my painting. If I want to paint this, I will start, as we always do, with watercolor, from light to dark. We decided that our background is going to be light, so I'm going to paint that background on a slightly damp sheet of paper. I'm using all my lightest colors, lemon yellow, new gamboge. I'm also dropping in some sap green, but I'm using a lot of water and I'm diluting these colors to keep them light. After I kind of approximately sketch the background, I can do a few more things to it later. I'm going to paint the flower with a smaller brush, using pretty much the same colors. I didn't draw anything, so I want to kind of draw with the brush and figure out where everything is going to be. Using slightly more intense mixture. We can also use a little bit of splattering to give our background some interest and texture. It's hard to make an even wash with watercolor, and splattering actually helps us to create some visual interest. So we will have a stalk that's going to be slightly darker than the background, but I want to keep fairly close to my reference photo. So I'm keeping everything very light. This will be my first layer, my lightest layer. I'm going to let it dry. Now let's paint the flower on top of what we already painted. The top of the flowers is very light, so I'm going to kind of leave them alone. I might add some highlights later. I am mostly going to work on the shadows that, like I said, are slightly darker than the background, and also on the stalk of the flower. As you see, I am not working on the focal point. Since it's dark, I'm leaving all the darkest areas to the very last. So once again, this is kind of standard approach to watercolor. So I am painting everything in order. Focal point. Kind of throws me off a little bit that I don't see it, so I'm going to use a small brush, very intense color, and paint the ladybug. I'm painting it on a dry area because you know what's going to happen if I drop paint into a wet area, everything will start to float away, so I don't want that. I'm going to use just some intense green for the head and the legs. I don't want to introduce some other color just yet. The fewer colors we use, the better usually the result looks. That's the rule of color harmony. Let's continue working on the flower with a smaller brush. Let's find some more shadows between all these petals. As watercolor dries, it lightens, so I can see some darker accents in the flower where the petals are attached to the stalk. And also where those little side branches of the stalk are, I can definitely darken those areas. And I want to bring a little more green on top there, find a little more definition in the petals, but I'm only going to bring that green to the edges of the flower, so already I'm using a little bit of negative painting. In a second we will talk about it in more detail. This was an interesting photo for me to try because the flower is very close in tone to the background. It's a fairly light background and fairly light flower. So I was wondering if I can paint it so that you can actually tell that it's a flower, and you can let me know in comments if I succeeded. I want my focal point to really stand out. because that's the whole point of my painting. So I'm going to use some indigo to paint the spots and darken a few areas on the head and the legs to give it a little more definition. There will be tiny little shadows on the ladybug. It's not flat, so we need to show the form like we usually do with everything else. Straighten it out a little bit so it's not squished. And of course we will need some opaque white to paint the markings on the ladybug. There is a big highlight, and also the stalk is pretty glossy, so it will have a few highlights on it as well. And also there are like a few dry petals here and there. They look kind of interesting, so I'm going to paint them as well with white ink. That was the usual order of painting. If we want to create a light background with a darker object and a dark focal point on it, we will go layer by layer from light to dark. Now let's give our brain a bit of a workout and try to paint a light flower on a darker background. This is a very important watercolor technique that we need to master, so it's always good to practice it. When we want to paint something light on a dark background with watercolor, we have to go the same way. We have to go from light areas to dark, but we will have to paint those dark areas negatively. We will have to paint around our focal point, which in this case will be the ladybug again, but also let's include the flower in the focal point too, and make it lighter than the background. So I will start again with painting the flower. I could start applying some color to the background, but that would be too confusing. I think I'm going to start with the flower and paint it fairly lightly, very similar to what I did before in the first version of this painting. Let's paint the ladybug. I have to use a small brush because the details are so tiny. I have to be a little bit careful. Also, good idea not to make the ladybug too detailed, right? Because we want the same level of detail throughout the painting. So it's really not necessary to show all the legs or every little whisker, antenna, whatever the bugs have. So even if we hint that there is something there, it will create interest and the viewers will understand what we're trying to show. I'm going to, again, to find some shadows in the flowers like I did before, some shadows on the stalk. And we could leave the painting like that, just on white paper, but let's attempt our negative painting technique. To a flat brush, it's a lot easier to control. I will have to paint a lot of straight lines, so it's easy to do with a flat brush. I found that if I kept the lines straight first, it's always easy for me to smooth out some edges instead of painting curves, and if the curve doesn't look right, it's much harder to correct. I'm using my favorite Cascade Green, and I'm dropping in some Scarlet Lake that I used for the ladybug to neutralize it. I know that these two colors create pretty nice kind of purplish green depending on the proportion, and everything looks pretty terrible right now, but when we paint negatively we just have to persevere. It's not a fast process. Just keep painting and keep building color. From time to time I'm switching to a larger brush because I want to pick up a lot more pigment. The thing about dark backgrounds, there is no middle ground. You have to apply enough color to push them to the back. Otherwise they will compete with your focal point. They will not be dark enough. And it's also hard to apply color very evenly with just one layer. So we need 2-3 layers to build the depth and build that even deep color. So let's keep working, let's keep dropping pigment onto the background. Of course, paying attention to our edges. You don't want to go over the focal point. We want to keep it light. We're painting negatively. But if something runs over or something happens or you drop paint in the wrong spot, you know what to do. Just clean your brush. Hopefully you have a container of clean water on the desk and pick up the puddle with a clean paper towel. So it is possible to make corrections in watercolor. All right, this is my first layer of the background. I'll let it dry. You see how much it lightened, and so far this background has no intention of going back, of being a background. We need to work on it some more. I'm going to use indigo that I used for some details on the ladybug, sticking to my fairly limited color palette, and I'm going to apply a second layer of intense color with a flat brush. And from that little corner, you see that now the background is starting to work. and the flower is starting to come forward and actually becoming a focal point. And again, I'll remind you, this technique is called negative painting, and we use it if we want to paint something light on a dark background with watercolor. And when you paint something like a stalk or a tree trunk, it's very important to make the background the same intensity on both sides of it, because if it's lighter on one side of the stalk and darker on the other, it's not going to look right. It will be like you broke up the space. So I try to pay attention to that. Some darker accents are necessary and they look right, but just they need to be placed strategically without messing up the background space. While my background is drying, I can work on the flower. First of all, I can bring in darker shadows into the flower, kind of connected to the background. It doesn't have to be one light colored mass, so I do need some shadows there. I do need some details. Of course, I switched to a smaller brush because it will be hard for me to do the details with a large brush. And also at this stage, I'm correcting the edges. So I'm going over my whole flower and making sure that the outlines of the petals are the way I want them to be. And at this stage, I can paint curves because I already have something to go by, and it's much easier for me to see what I need to do and what corrections I need to make. Let's darken the ladybug too. After all, it's our focal point. That's the main character of this painting. That's what we're trying to show. And if you want to get technical on ladybug, I'm painting positively, right? Because it's lighter and I'm painting darker areas on light. So hopefully after this video, you will have an excellent understanding of the difference between these two techniques and when you need to use each one of them. I often get questions from my students. How do you plan your painting? How do you know what to paint first? So you go from light to dark, and that's how you decide what you need to do. The focal point, the flower itself, doesn't have to be all light. So I'm going to darken the stalk a little more, and maybe it can even be darker than the background. Nobody said that everything has to be the same way, right? So we can let the background lighten slightly towards the bottom and let the stalk to be darker than the background. The most important thing is to keep the background fairly smooth, not to have all those streaks. So if you want some texture, it needs to be deliberate, right? It needs to be controlled. But if it's just random streaks, probably we want to take a damp brush, no water on it, just slightly damp, and maybe even out the brush strokes. Alright, my painting dried. Finishing touches will always be the highlights. So let's go find them, just a few in our painting. Maybe some of them don't have to be pure white, so I'm toning down my ink with lemon yellow watercolor to give a little more definition to some of the petals. Negative painting is fairly difficult technique, and your edges most likely will not look perfect. It will depend, of course, how much time you will spend. I'm painting pretty quickly, and I think it's much easier to just correct the edges at the end of the painting than to paint them absolutely perfectly from the beginning. So I'm going to fix those edges, maybe add a few petals here and there just to make my flower look a little more interesting. White ink in combination with watercolor looks very natural. From a distance you can't tell that this was painted on top of darker areas. It blends on the paper really well, and you see how small are those details that I'm painting. So if I had to paint all around them negatively, it is possible, but of course it will take a lot more time. Splattering for texture, for visual interest, a few more highlights. I hope this video was useful. Let me know in comments what you think. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video here on Tamirab Studios channel. Help other artists to see this video by liking or sharing it. To see future videos, subscribe and click the bell button to be notified when they're published. Thanks again, and stay creative!